Right, excellent. Thank you very much indeed, Claire. That was really interesting. Thank you very much indeed for that. My name's Andrew Katz. I'm a lawyer, and I've been advising on free and open source software since the last millennium. And as a lawyer, I started, as lawyers tend to look at compliance in terms of license texts. And then it very rapidly occurred to me there's a lot more to compliance and risk management within organizations than looking at open source license texts. For one thing, there's a huge combinatorial problem because many pieces of software these days have hundreds of thousands of different components in. Then after that, I realized that not only do you have to understand all of the components and all of the licenses are applicable to those components, but you also have to understand how the piece of software in question was developed in the first place, the relationship between all the components, the relationship between the licenses. And very rapidly, we start talking about the great topics, for example, that Dawn was talking about earlier in terms of community and in terms of viability, governance, et cetera, et cetera. So, several years ago, I founded a consultancy called OpenUK, which advises much more broadly in terms of open source compliance. And more recently, Stephen has come on board to give us some real insights within the organization in terms of how governance and strategy are relevant as far as open source compliance is concerned. So Stephen, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I will do. Thanks very much, Andrew. Yep, so hello there, I'm Stephen Pollard. I've spent a lot of time working with people really on just how do we manage something that's complicated? Yep, and how do we understand when something is good and when we're managing our risk appropriately? And this is what I'm going to be talking about very shortly. Andrew, did you want to lead into the intro?
Indeed, yeah, let's do that. So what have we got up on the... Okay, let's move on to the next slide. We have a large client engagement at the moment, and this client is trying to examine all of their open source operations to ensure that they are run in an effective and compliant manner. And one of the things that arose out of that was the discussion about the concept of maturity model. Now, what is a maturity model? Well, it's a framework for determining the degree of capability, adaptability, and resilience of business function within an organization. So what we're trying to do here is to obtain a set of metrics that enables you to determine the state of any particular business function within an organization and then use those metrics to improve the organization. And that includes reduction of risk, it includes better operations, and ultimately it includes also making the organization a better place to work as well. It also includes improving trust within the supply chain. So, Stephen.
Okay, thank you for that. So really, it's just a question of saying, okay, well, we have real ambition. We want to be good at something. We want to be able to contribute to the community, but we also want to manage complexity and maybe some very difficult risks in our business. How do we measure that? How do we understand how well we're doing? And what we're talking about here is all based on work with the OpenChain project. If you're familiar with that, it's a Linux Foundation project. And this capability maturity model is something we're developing with the OpenChain project as a means to help answer that question. And we're really keen to join with people in looking at these questions. How well are we doing? How do we measure success? And how do we come together and understand the areas that we need to develop to do that successfully? So inside a capability maturity model, you need to be able to define, well, what do we mean by maturity? So there's a fundamental concept in this model which works on a simple scoring basis. When you're able to pretty much deliver under 3, something has been defined, it's produced, it's there are processes in place, but are we actually measuring proper results, as Dawn was talking about metrics. So if you're getting to the level of having metrics in place, you may be at the level of 4. And if you're using those metrics and you're actually learning from them and you're making changes in your organization, you're beginning to optimize, then you may have something at level 5. The other core concept in the model is shown underneath. When we thought about this model, we really wanted to create something that's just useful rather than academic exercise. So if you're going to measure how well you're doing, you want to be able to turn that into something tangible about what we're going to do next to improve our score. And the fundamental components of how we're working with our people, what information do we have, what processes are we running, and what systems or tools do we have in place. These are the really tangible things that you can do to improve how you're working. And those are the fundamental elements inside the model. So if you take those concepts, you can see ultimately you may be able to give yourself a score for how well you're doing against each of those 4 different concepts. And you can begin to think about, well, there's a target that we're wanting to achieve. So how good do we really need to be? Is our business here, is this project all about driving for leadership across a whole broad community and challenging the norm and setting new benchmarks? Or are we actually just wanting to be good, compliant, good enough, and managing risk and moving on and something more exciting? So you can think about how organizations may have different targets in mind, and those targets and how well you're doing then, of course, is the gap that you're trying to close. So, Andrew, you're going to talk a little bit about OpenChain?
So the capability maturity model that Stephen's just been talking about works across all different aspects of a business. It's not specifically limited to software development. So what we've taken the OpenChain specification and we've used that as the basis for developing a specific capability and maturity model for open source compliance, which is specifically what OpenChain's about. So very, very briefly, if you're not familiar with OpenChain, it's a Linux Foundation project and it's a standard for defining a framework for open source license compliance. It's now an international standard, so there's the ISO number up there. It can be adopted by companies from the very smallest to the very largest, and also it's nothing to do with blockchain, which does confuse people sometimes. And this is just a set of some of the organizations that are supporting OpenChain. There are many thousands more.
Okay, so thank you. And if you are familiar with the standard, you may begin to recognize some of the things that are on the page here. If not, what you have here is the set of the business activities that you need to be able to demonstrate that you're doing if you can say we're actually managing our open source capabilities well. And we organize them into 3 layers, and very much as Dawn was talking about earlier on, you need a governance and a strategy layer. You also need a middle layer, a layer which is, okay, well, how are we going to go about organizing ourselves? How are we going to enable people to be effective? How are we going to build the community? So that middle layer is all about enabling and also then measuring. And then finally, the bottom layer, which is a technical delivery area, which is the technical side of, okay, how do we understand license commitments? How do we understand our contributions? How do we produce the necessary artifacts? And how do we actually deliver good quality open source software? And all of that is built within the model. And then once you work from that point, you're then able to think, okay, well, for each of those different capabilities, and if you remember our 4 different concepts of people and organization and information, process, and systems, well, what represents good practice? And this is the area that we're developing in cooperation with a lot of people, defining, well, what does good practice mean in these areas so we can then give ourselves a score. And here's the illustration of what the question set is for evaluation for a really core capability, which is the production of bill of materials. And then if you move on from that, you can see then that ultimately you can give yourself a dashboard and you can compare your performance and understand what you need to do to improve. And on the way through, we had a good think about the way in which organizations and projects will be able to sort of make change stick for the long term, because we came across many situations where people say, oh yeah, we got ourselves up to a good standard of open source OpenChain compliance, and yet that's fallen by the wayside and things have been difficult. And so there's something that we've built into the model that sets this question apart about, okay, well, if we're going to make lasting change in the organization, how are we really going to make a difference? We've put some of those into the model too. So really, where we're left is sort of we're up for conversations with people as to, okay, well, what do you think is useful? And some of the case studies we have, this is where a current client has been looking at this question. They're really committed to demonstrating really good quality of compliance and work in open source. They see it as vital to their reputation and to their brand. So whilst they have a history of achieving good open source compliance, they wanted to be able to showcase where they're improving and where else they're going next. And they're actually relaunching and renewed efforts. And this tool has enabled them to take stock across a very large and very complex organization with many, many different teams and capabilities. Another area that we're finding a lot is when it comes to mergers and acquisitions, and when organizations are wanting to buy a particular product, you find there's open source components within it, or if you're looking to sell the whole organization, you need to demonstrate a credible capability in terms of how well this risk has been managed. Because from an insurance point of view, it can be very hard these days to get insurance to cover that mergers and acquisition risk, and it's a whole area of interest that is developing. And on that note, that takes us on to a parallel project. You just wanted to give a quick mention to, Andrew, the Corinthian project with the Eclipse Foundation.
Yeah, this is very closely related. It's really about risk management through the production of legal documents that are going to be made open source, available for anyone to use. So it's an open source project which is based on documentation, and it's very closely tied to the work that we are doing on the capability maturity model, because it also turns out that the CMM is really a great way of allocating risk, and risk is obviously one of the major factors that you're considering when you're looking at legal documentation, and certainly when you're looking at using that legal documentation to implement some form of transaction. So just to make it clear, the work that we're doing on the CMM, we're also going to make that publicly available through the auspices of the Open Chain project as well. So we're also planning on developing a community around that. So either if you want to get involved with the Corinthian project, if you sort of pop onto the next slide, there's a QR code up there that will take you to the landing page. It was only launched last week, so at the moment there aren't any documents hosted, but we're hoping that within a week or so they're there. They just need formatting in ASCII doc format. So if you want to get involved either in that or in the wider open chain based CMM that we're developing, please do get in touch, because as I say, we're very keen to get a community developing around that.
All right. That's it. Thank you very much.